been sat at this delightful little cafe for the best part of an hour and a half now. You've not had a sip of coffee, but the pot plant next to you's been remarkably well fed as you keep asking for refills. The pastry in front of you has not entered your mouth but once, but you've occupied yourself peeling off the thin layers of its skin, flicking them away in the breeze. No, your attention here isn't on the patisserie, it's on that church on the other side of the piazza, that magnificent stone building, that edifice of religion, that monument to faith. In your breathing days you used to attend regularly, of course. You took the sacrament, you spoke the words, but you weren't there because you were a believer. You were there because of a woman. As you so often were in life, you were often dragged from pillar to post by your devotion to certain females. Not one of them ever knew your name, not one of them ever deigned to speak to you, but you would get to know them, you'd get to follow them, know where they live, know what their interests were. You'd like to examine them every inch if you could, but often your gaze was thwarted by clothing curtains or other. Now, of course, you've occupied so much of your time since being dead sitting in this cafe, watching this woman across the piazza whenever she leaves the church at night time, looking through the fountain, the spray of the water, watching her majestic frame as it makes its way across over to the bus stop. Still, she would not recognise you, still she would not know your name, but still you are obsessed with her, even in death, even now that you're a blood drinker. It's not necessarily even that you want to tell her how much you feel. You've never told a woman how you feel because you've never had the confidence to tell a woman how you feel. But this one's special. This was the one you were obsessed with when you died, when you were brought back. She's always held a place in your heart. You've known she is a missing piece of a puzzle, a missing piece of your puzzle. You know that somehow she's a touchstone, she's keeping you on the straight and narrow, she's keeping you on the path of righteousness, the priest might say. And you can't help but get to your feet as you see the congregation spilling out into the piazza. You can't help but kick your chair back and lay cash on the table as you see her make her way past the fountain, illuminated in the moonlight. That sprinkle of water just making a frame hazy with beauty. You'd love to taste her, you'd love to taste her blood. You'd sworn off drinking blood from humans after the first time. You've only been a vampire for the past 3 years and you've largely subsisted off of dogs, rats and the like, but the one time you tried to feed from a mortal, it just went horribly wrong. The human, he bled out, he was exsanguinated, you didn't know what to do, you didn't know the correct procedure. When your sire found out, he just laughed, he said, "Stupid girl, you can fix this, but first we need to put this body in a shallow grave, a long way away from the city, and not tell anyone about it." And so that's what you did. You buried the poor man fairly deep and try to put it from your mind, but still the only blood you've been drawn to since that time is that of your beloved, that of the victim of your obsession, the woman who you wish you could express your true feelings for. And as you start making your way across the piazza, as you so often do, hoping against hope that you might catch up with her, hoping that you might pluck up the courage to tell her for so long you've loved her, your eyes get drawn a few steps back. Your eyes get drawn to another man, keeping in lockstep with this lady, his eyes burrowing into the back of her head. He's watching her, his eyes glowing with a strange yellow tint even in this light, and his skin pale, waxy. You could perhaps mistake him for one of your own kind, except you examine him more closely. You're not so sure. In fact, there's a flicker of recognition. If you could take an intake of breath, you would. No, this man that's following her, this is the man you killed, quite by accident, but this is the man you slew, you drained his blood. This was over a year ago. He can't be a vampire, can he? He doesn't show the semblance of a vampire as you look at him, as you focus on him. Your mind goes back. Something your sire told you, a paranoid mechet if ever there was one. He told you once the story of these entities, these stricks, these shadow creatures that could apparently possess bodies, possess corpses, possess vampires even, and go after the things we love, the things we care about. They are possessed of nothing but malevolence, and they would do nothing more than seek to destroy us if they could. This was a nightmare, a boogeyman tale, something to keep you awake during the day. You felt your sire was always laughing at you. But now you're not so sure, and he seems to be speeding up to catch up with her. You pump the vitae in your body. You know she's in danger, you know you need to save her, and then you see him. He turns his head in a very unnatural fashion, a bit like an owl might, and he grins straight at you. He knows you're watching, and he knows he can reach her before you can. And you sprint across the piazza, towards her, to safeguard her, to ward her. But will you reach her in time, or will she just be blood spilt upon the cobblestones beneath the moonlight? Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming, and my review of Vampire the Requiem Second Edition, or Blood and Smoke, the Strix Chronicle as my version is entitled, as I bought it before it was rebranded as Vampire the Requiem Second Edition. Onyx Path Publishing took a little while to decide, well, CCP, their overlords, took a little while to decide whether New World of Darkness would receive a second edition. It has, and so Blood and Smoke, which was the sort of 1.5 update to Vampire the Requiem, has now been fully christened as Vampire the Requiem Second Edition. So that's the story of that. Now, it's taken a little while for me to review this book, and that's because I was tossing and turning. Is it a conflict of interest for me to review a book by Onyx Path Publishing, given that I now do freelance work for them? I finally decided that no, it isn't, because I, for one thing, did not write for this book, and for another thing, I've never even written for the developer before, as much as I would like to. Great admirer of her work. Rose Bailey is one of the best developers at the company right now, but I have no connection to this book, so I felt that in my typical fashion I can highlight the positives and indeed some of the negatives of this book, and maybe give you an informed piece of advice as to whether or not you may wish to pick it up. So, what is contained within Vampire the Requiem Second Edition? Did Vampire the Requiem need a second edition? To my mind, it did. My main problem with Requiem was always, as much as I love the toolbox approach, it really helps for the imaginative storyteller, those who want to just create a world from the ground up. It was a little too loose for my liking. There wasn't enough direction, and that was fine for me for the most part, but I understood quite a lot of the people I play with, a lot of the players I know, were put off because it lost so much of that feel that Vampire the Masquerade had. Now, Vampire the Masquerade is a game that is largely about world-shaking events. It's about how your role affects the wider world. Vampire the Requiem is quite different. Well, you could argue Masquerade is about outer darkness, Requiem is about inner darkness. It is a game, as implied in the introduction here, about such things as sex and murder. It is a game about tragedy and romance. It is about the horror of being a vampire, the things you lose and the things that you gain. While the political elements are there, of course, you have the covenants, you have the clans, you have their bickering, their politicking and the like, just as you do in Masquerade, between sects and clans and various other organisations and other supernaturals. And you can interchange the two depending on whether you want to play a political chronicle or a personal chronicle. You can do the same thing in Masquerade. Requiem has always been more heavily geared towards that personal feel. The quintessential personal horror game, to my mind, was Vampire the Requiem, and Vampire the Requiem Second Edition does not disappoint on that count. In fact, it makes it even more honed, dangerously so. It is a game that will really make you think as a player, as a storyteller, because of the things that your character can lose and the things your character can gain, the emphases that are placed in this game on your character and your character's connections to humanity and other vampires is something unlike what Onyx Path Publishing and White Wolf preceding them have done before. So, the introduction, of course, deals with themes and moods, and this is a game that's heavily about mood. It's a game of blood and smoke. It's a game where you should be able to taste the air, where the world around you should feel partly alive, partly dead, or undead, if you would prefer. The world itself is vampiric, but that does not necessarily mean that the world is a shocking one, whereas the classic World of Darkness, everything is turned up to 11 in terms of corruption and horror. In Requiem, I would argue that that's less the case. The horror is inborn, it is inbuilt, it is what you do with yourself now that you're undead that creates that horror, and this is something that's emphasised in the introduction, along with, of course, inspirations such as Camilla. Dracula, interestingly enough, is not mentioned, but the movie, a fantastic movie, a noir movie called Brick is, if you've not seen Brick, it's a brilliant movie that deals with its own all-night society, as it were. The Chapter 1 jumps straight into clans and covenants. Now, we won't spend too much time with these because clans and covenants haven't changed a huge amount from the first edition, except to make them infinitely more playable and attractive. The clans are each laid out with why would you wish to join us, why should you fear us, and why should we fear ourselves. That's a fantastic series of hooks, and it just constantly asks the player, the reader, the storyteller questions. What are you thinking of when you're thinking of a Deva? What is your biggest attraction? What is your biggest regret? Who did you love? Who did you obsess over when you were alive? What kind of lusts still drive you, quite unnaturally, now that you're a blood drinker, now that you're a vampire, now that the only thing you technically have to do is subsist off of vitae? You can still practice those things you enjoyed as a mortal. Which vices still grab you? And this is the same case for every single clan. I'm a particular fan of the artwork for Clan Gangrel, that being Dracula. There's a few Draculas in Vampire the Requiem. This is the biker one for Clan Gangrel. The Deva, the Gangrel, the Mekhet, the terrifying Nosferatu, and the Lordly Ventrue are still the 5 clans of Requiem. They are still the condensed clans that are required in a game like this. And while bloodlines are still a possibility, as detailed later on in the book, none are actually given screen time, or page word count rather, in this book. I would say that while the clans actually receive a decent amount of exposure, including a fantastic section for each on how to create a monster, which goes into detail on, okay, so if you want to play a character with a big focus on majesty, you're probably going to want to put points in these skills, these attributes. That may sound like metagaming to you, but so many times have I encountered players who create a character who looks fantastic on paper, then they go to roll for their 3rd point in animalism and find out they've got no points in the required requisites, as it were. So that's a really good assist, especially for new players, and this is a game that really works for new players, I've found. The one thing it doesn't have, I would say, is, I'm losing my train of thought, yes, the bloodlines, which is a shame, because Vampire the Requiem First Edition did have bloodlines in. Again, it's a word count thing. I almost feel like they could have excised bloodlines entirely, and I don't think it would have harmed the book terribly. After all, the bloodlines books from Requiem First Edition still exist, they're still over my shoulder, and they're still available on Drive-Thru RPG. The Covenants are the areas of this game, in terms of setting, to my mind, that really work a lot better in Second Edition. Historically, they would be almost continuously at odds. You would have been hard-pressed to find an Invictus plus Carthian coterie that wasn't at each other's throats. Same with Loncaret Sanctum and the Circle of the Crone, with the Ordo Dracul often looking like a lemon on the side. There's a lot more reason now to actually have a mixed coterie, and what's more, whereas the Invictus and the Carthian movement were seen as depowered in the previous edition because it was only when they had their Covenant books released that they gained powers of their own, akin to Theban sorcery, akin to the mysteries of the Ordo Dracul, that they started coming into their own. Those powers that are associated with those covenants are actually detailed in this book, along with a host of merits that makes those covenants infinitely more attractive to play. They were always attractive from a player perspective or a storyteller perspective, but you could end up feeling quite depowered in certain situations. One of the nice touches that I find in Chapter 1, as it deals with the clans and the covenants, is it actually deals with some of the lost clans and broken covenants, so historic organisations, historic groups that no longer exist, at least not in any great number, but it does mean that if you ever want to set a game in a historic era, then you've got plenty to pull from. My greatest criticism, as far as covenants go, is there's no page count devoted to Belial's Brood, who, if you've watched my review from many years back of the Belial's Brood sourcebook, will probably know I waxed lyrical about that book. I think it's one of the best supplements. I do love Belial's Brood as an antagonist, and indeed as a protagonist. and hope that they receive additional coverage in the upcoming Covenants book for Vampire the Requiem Second Edition. I have no doubt they will, but it's something I'm particularly keen to see, because even 7, the VII, mysterious, almost assassination group, the historic boogeymen of Vampire the Requiem, are portrayed as a potentially playable group in this book, when in original Vampire the Requiem you needed to get the source book in order to do that. Chapter 2, the All Night Society, deals with asking players, readers, storytellers the questions that they need to be asking themselves as they create a vampire. Where do you go to feed? What kind of people do you feed from? What sort of shelter would you look for? What connection do you have to mortality? What kind of relationship do you have with other kindred? It goes into further detail, such as it covers the traditions that exist within Requiem. There are only 3 at this point: Masquerade, Progeny, and Amaranth. Amaranth being cannibalism, diablerie, the destruction of another vampire. Progeny, interestingly now, does not require the authority of an elder or prince in order to embrace a new human and make him a vampire. Now it's just, if you embrace and you make a child, the responsibility for that child lays solely on you, so don't embrace a complete tool. There's also some lovely detail based on how to construct a city that's pulled with some detail from Damnation City, a brilliant source book for Vampire the Requiem, one of my favourites, as well as Malkavia, the infection that runs riot through Ventru and potentially other clans. Now, I happen to think that it's nice to have these old nods back to Masquerade, and indeed the clan books for Requiem, which I've covered in some detail through my Guide to Requiem Vampire videos. Those are also brilliant books, and they're in fact cited as inspiration at the beginning of this book. It's worth noting that, because you can tell which source books have been pulled heavily from and which ones have kind of been left fallow at this point. Not to say any of them are weaker than others, but the development team for Requiem Second Edition clearly acknowledge the best quality books from First Edition. There are guidelines for playing in Neonate Chronicles and Scylla Chronicles, that being sort of middle-of-the-road vampires who've been around for a few hundred years perhaps, and Elder Chronicles, where you've been around even longer than that, and there's a lovely lexicon in Chapter 2 as well. Now, before I go any further, it's worth my pointing out that between every single chapter there is fiction, very high quality fiction. I enjoyed it a great deal, and what's more, there's some fantastic art, and I'm just flicking between pages now just to find some art. Oh, and well, there you go, there's appropriately enough, talking about sex and murder. The art in this book, if you get the premium hardcover colour edition, you will not be disappointed with the artwork in this book. I had my doubts about full colour artwork in a vampire, but because I suppose I'm used to the palettes of red or black and white Tim Bradstreet style from Masquerade and so on, but it just pops from the page. There's some art pieces that don't match my aesthetic taste, we should say, but in the main, I absolutely adore the art in this book. It just bursts from the page. It gives you such a fantastic feel for the dark, erotic, seductive nature of vampire that often vampire games lack. It really highlights their, well, predatory aura, I suppose, which, speaking of, does not exist to the same degree in this game as it did in the previous Requiem. Vampires, when they see each other for the first time, don't automatically feel inclined to strike at each other or run away, thankfully. That was a rule that did not carry over. We then have Chapter 3, Laws of the Dead. Laws of the Dead is character creation. It's in character creation that I find quite a lot of books make or break for me, and I can happily say that this book does not disappoint in this regard. Why do I say this? Well, because there's various new features in character creation that help make your characters so much more interesting than stats on a sheet. For instance, rather than having virtues and vices as you did in Vampire the Requiem First Edition, you now have masks and dirges. Masks being your demeanour, dirges being your nature. Yes, they borrow them from Masquerade, but it works. It works for Vampire. as with Masquerade, when you play your masks and your dirges, you can recover willpower points. You also still deal with blood potency, you still get to choose a covenant and a clan, and you still get to select your attributes and your skills. And most importantly of all, you have touchstones. I mentioned one of these in the intro fiction that I threw out there, and I missed a couple of things, but that's what happens when you ramble off in an improvisational fashion. You can attach a touchstone to your character, and a touchstone is someone who fits in around humanity level 6, your humanity ranging from 1 to 10. And your touchstone can be an individual person, it can be an object, it can be a location, something of importance to you from the time you're a mortal to the time you're a vampire, and something that will make your humanity hinge or tilt or shatter if this touchstone is harmed. All of a sudden you've got an investment in your humanity. This is something that World of Darkness games have, to a degree, lacked. It's odd because the games have often laboured the importance of humanity, and yet it's one of the first things to be discarded in the course of play. Now touchstones, not dissimilar to fetters in Wraith the Oblivion, are the kinds of things that keep you whole. If you lose your touchstone, you have the great possibility of developing conditions, breaking down, succumbing to the beast, and who knows what else. It gives your character something personal that the storyteller can incorporate in the game, and the players can incorporate in the game as well, because each vampire will have one. Vampires as well do no longer have their clan weaknesses, they instead have clan banes, and their clan banes only come into effect when you reach a certain level of humanity as you descend down the track. So while you're still high up on the track, you are perfectly fine to go about with only the regular vampire curses. What's more, you have some additional rule changes, and I believe I'm going into some of the following chapter, but we'll get to it. You have different beasts now. You don't just have one irate voice in your head telling you to tear that guy's throat out. You now have a monstrous beast who probably is telling you to do that, a seductive beast, so there's your Dracula type, and the competitive beast, an alpha predator. And depending on the reaction you want to portray, you can portray your beast in any fashion. I think that's a really nice touch. It gives the beast added facets. Again, it makes me feel a little like Wraith the Oblivion, the Shadow, and that's by no means a criticism, because I have a lot of love for Wraith, with good reason. It's a brilliant game. I have to point out again as well, as I'm flicking through this for reference, the art just never fails to grab me. So, what else do we have to cover in this section? Yes, weaknesses, health. So, vampires still suffer from an aversion to fire and sunlight and the like. However, they no longer deal aggravated damage. Vampires always range from bashing, lethal, and aggravated. Interestingly, they only start doing aggravated damage again as your humanity descends, and what's more, if your humanity is high enough, you can actually go out during the day undercover. That completely turns Requiem on its head. None of the vampire games that have been released by White Wolf or Onyx Path up until now have actually really advocated doing that. Now that's a feature in the game. You can start playing vampire in a completely different way. You can completely discard that rule if you like, but if you want to start playing games akin to, I suppose, Blade, akin to, perhaps, Buffy, where your vampire's running around like Spike with a leather jacket over his head, you can do that. And I think that's a nice feature, because you're not sparkling in sunlight, but it does mean there's a benefit to maintaining that humanity. Again, it appeals to the personal horror element, it appeals to the personal tragedy. If your humanity starts to degrade, then your character starts to degrade with it. Clan Banes, I mentioned the clans no longer have weaknesses, they have Banes. So, for instance, a Bane for the Deva, they are wanton. Deva immerse themselves in the mortal world. If not only feeds them, it compels them. When Deva choose vessels, they become obsessed. When they drink from a mortal once, they're fine. On their second and further drinks from the same source, roll humanity. Failure causes the persistent dependent condition towards the mortal. The condition only goes away with the mortal's death. For this reason, Deva tend toward either remarkable promiscuity or they cultivate massive harems and herds. We'll deal with conditions shortly, but that's another fantastic feature of World of Darkness Second Edition that I covered briefly in God Machine Chronicle. So, another feature, another new feature for Vampire the Requiem is merits and the fact that you get 10 points to spend on them. Now this is a rule I'm a little iffy on, partly because I quite like underpowered games, but I understand a lot of people felt that vampires were the weakest of the bunch in New World of Darkness. That's a fairly decent and I would say honest criticism there. With 10 points of merits you really are no longer the weakling, you are an undead monster, you can throw your weight around. Merits don't all of course have to be physical, they don't all have to be channeled into your disciplines or anything like that, disciplines being your vampiric powers. For instance, let's just find one. Bearing in mind you have 10 points of these, this will hopefully highlight how powerful a merit is, and as we're here, have some more art to just quickly look at, yes. So we have Carthian Pull. As long as you have 1 point in Carthian status, that's another merit. The effect is Carthians know people. Being the Covenant arguably most in touch with humanity, they tend to have the most numerous connections. Membership in the movement can mean leveraging those connections. Each month you can access a number of dots of the allies, contacts, haven and herd merits equal to your Carthian status. That's incredibly useful for just one dot. Let's find one that's no prerequisites. Distinguished Palate, 1 point merit. Effect, your character can discern the subtle nuances in blood and vitae. Consider any taste of blood roll an exceptional success with only one single success. So when taking this merit you can actually determine things like hair colour, drugs in the system, blood type and so on just by tasting the blood. You can actually start moulding your characters around their merits if you so wish. I think that's a nice feature. And as I just briefly covered system, and it's not something I've covered in any length, at any length, it's still D10s, it's still dice pools, so in other words, you have, let's say you've got 3 points in dexterity, let's say you've got 2 points in larceny, so you want to pick someone's pocket, what you do is roll 5 10-sided dice, because 3 for dex, 2 for larceny. Every 10 you roll can be re-rolled, and on and on and on, because you're aiming for 8s and above. 8s and above are successes. Certain elements can reduce, not reduce the difficulty, but reduce the number of dice you may roll, if for instance there's people watching you when you're trying to pick this pocket, or maybe give you additional dice because the guy is drunk, perhaps. Wands will actually... Wands don't count as critical successes, but if you happen to be rolling 1 die because you have no relevant attribute or skill to be using at this time, or perhaps you're debilitated in some way and so you can't do it, that's called a chance die. If that chance die is rolled as a 1, a catastrophic failure occurs. So that's the system basically. You're aiming for 8s and above, 10s re-roll, and if you have no appropriate skill or attribute, you roll 1 chance die no matter what, and if it rolls a 1 then you're fucked, buddy. So one more merit. We have, let's see, something that's clan specific. Nosferatu, unsettling gaze. 1 point. All haunts have an unsettling effect, haunts being the Nosferatu nickname. Your character's beast oozes with terror. When she evokes the monstrous beast, again referring back to those many multifaceted beasts, she unsettles her target deeply and makes him question himself. Anytime she infects a victim with the bestial condition and scores an exceptional success, she also forces a breaking point if the victim has a higher humanity than hers. So in other words, they will soon be accumulating conditions. Let's actually get straight onto conditions at this point, because they're not covered at this point in the book, which is a little odd for layout in my opinion, but I'll cover them now. What is a condition in something like Blood and Smoke or the God Machine Chronicle? Well, a condition is a debilitative, or it can actually be a pleasant effect, where, for instance, you may be wanton. I've actually got these on cards. You can order them on cards from Drive-Thru-RPG. You may be raptured. You may be languid. Let's have a read of one of them. So, Your character for language. Your character feels the draw of torpor. That's the unconscious state that vampires can fall into. His actions grow sluggish each night that passes until eventually he falls to the sleep of ages. Every night that passes with this condition, levy a cumulative -1 die penalty on all actions. As well, rising from day sleep requires a point of vitae for each dot of blood potency, so the more powerful you are, the more difficult it will be to rise. The possible sources of being languid: losing a touchstone, it can affect you that way. Resolution: if you fall to torpor, you can get rid of that condition. Now, what is the point of having conditions? Why do you want them as players? Quite simple. When you resolve a condition, you gain a beat. And as you gain beats, you gain experience points. Beats convert to experience. So in other words, players are rewarded by putting their characters in dangerous situations that may result in them gaining conditions, because that is the way they advance. After all, it's experience. Experience denotes an experience. And experiences aren't always pleasant. We also have disciplines in this book. I'm not going to cover them in great detail. Needless to say, they are brilliant. I do love the way they've been fleshed out, balanced out. In fact, they've all been given a little more power than they had before. It actually makes them interesting to read, and this is something I've often struggled with powers in games before. I find them a bit encyclopedic, a bit like reading a dictionary perhaps, and I only refer to them when I come to use them. These disciplines are actually fun to read, and the same goes for the entire book. I mentioned in the Outbreak Undead review that felt like an encyclopedia. It wasn't a book you could just pick up and read from beginning to end. Vampire the Requiem Second Edition is not that. You can, in fact, read it from beginning to end and enjoy the reading of it, because there's so many questions thrown your way, there's so much fiction within it, there's so much that can just grab you and pull you in. I really do like this book. You may be able to tell because I'm waxing on. The disciplines, of course, also cover Cruac, Theban sorcery, the mystery, so you have all of your clan disciplines such as animalism, vigour, and your celerity, and your majesty, and your dominate and whatnot, but you also have your covenant-specific powers as well. Now, Chapter 4 covers the rules of the night, so when you may be called on to use your attributes and skills. Again, it seems an odd placing, in part because it refers to these attributes and skills in the previous chapter, then it goes into detail in the following one. But the strongest part of this chapter, to my mind, as well as some very thorough details on equipment, all kinds of weird equipment you may want to pick up, not all of it aggressive. For instance, let's see, I think you've got stun guns, stun guns, rope, caltrops, climbing gear, lock-picking kits, keylogging software, smartphones and the like, along with their associated resource cost, their availability, their durability and so on. You have the kinds of rolls you will have to make for certain checks. So for instance, what I'm holding up there was intimidation. So you either use strength or manipulation as your attribute plus intimidation, minus the victim's composure, at which point you roll your dice and aim to get 8s and above. Simple as that. So we have that. And again, I'm not going to labour this too long because this review is going on at length, because I want to spend a fair amount of time on Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 5 being the Parliament of Owls. Now, I mentioned the Strix in the opening monologue, and the Strix are the antagonist of this game. Yes, you may find that odd, that in a World of Darkness game there is an antagonist set up to be at odds with you. The Strix first appeared in Requiem for Rome. They have appeared throughout various fictions since then, and they are the boogeymen of vampires. They are vampires of their own ilk. They are shadow creatures, entities, that often take the forms of owls and observe from on high with glowing yellow eyes, until they decide, and they develop the power, with their shallow potency discipline that's detailed in this chapter, to possess a corpse, maybe if they're more powerful, a ghoul or revenant, and if they're even more powerful than that, a vampire. And once they are in possession of a body, it's almost impossible to tell that they are Strix. What do they want to do? Well, that differs on the Strix, but I can guarantee you this, not one of them is going to be friendly. You could have some interesting chronicles where you have to temporarily ally with them, but for the most part they despise kindred for some unknown and only conjectural reason. The book actually covers how to, and now actually we have a fantastic illustration here of some Strix. I don't want the light focusing on it, there we go. So, we have their powers, such as their shadow potency, their dread powers, their dooms, essentially, which are frightening all on their own. And I have to say the Strix are a very appealing antagonist to put into a game. And they could feel optional, but I'll get to that. But we also have a gallery of rogues. We have a whole bunch of examples Strix left throughout this chapter. A good 15 or so, I've not counted them, but there's at least a dozen. And some of my favourites are Granny, the Lady of Shivs, but my personal preference, and I'll read out the introduction for him if I can find him easily, is Old Man Marsh. The old man looks up at you as you pass him by, a toothy grin barely visible behind his long, ratty beard. His eyes glint yellow in the streetlight's glare. He stands and coughs a bit, and you hear him muttering something unintelligible. Despite his lurching gait, he keeps up with you just the same as you speed up, and you smell something familiar, old dried blood clotting his beard. Old Man Marsh is hunger. He is not subtle, he is not suave, he does not seduce his victims. He is a stalker and a brutal killer. He is the urban legend, well, one of many Strix urban legends among vampires in cities. And when a Strix comes to town, expect paranoia, expect civil war, as everyone starts pointing fingers in a fashion not dissimilar to The Thing, as no one knows who the real Strix is, and it's very, very difficult to tell. So, Chapter 6 is another chapter I just wanted to cover in some detail. It's the world we die in. And this is a fun chapter to read, because the World of Darkness, New World of Darkness, often felt like it was shallow. There wasn't much in the way of city sourcebooks. There were some, but there weren't too many, and so you were often left to build everything from the ground up. Not so in Vampire the Requiem Second Edition. You have locations from all around the globe detailed in this chapter, to about the tune of around 4 pages each, which is plenty enough to give you chronicle seeds, plot hooks and the like, that range from Athens to Beijing to Tokyo, and the Research Triangle in America, which coincidentally has a brand new clan within it. It's detailed in this chapter, the Jiangxi. Does that sound familiar to you? And what else? We also have Swansea in Wales, which is given a fantastic write-up, awfully accurate actually, given its eeriness. I'd say my favourite is either Swansea or Tokyo. I love the idea of vampire families, vampire Zaibatsu families, which is what's covered here. I didn't enjoy Athens to the same degree, it didn't grab me as much, but and I'd say Berlin falls somewhere in the middle ground there, and you do know I have a great love for Berlin and the Hof. Now, the final chapter is storytelling advice, which is how to run your chronicles. It does kind of come out of nowhere, the storytelling chapter. I'd say in terms of layout it's not my favourite placing. It covers what your masks and dirges are there, what your aspirations may be, or aspirations to put in the place of your players, and how to run chronicles that incorporate such things as blood, potency, and there your various conditions are also detailed. How to handle things such as pacing in a game and the climbing of the Covenant ladder and so on. I'm reading off headings from within the chapter, but it's plenty detailed enough. This chapter is followed by appendices based on the living and playing ghouls. Ghouls are now infinitely more playable and appealing to my mind. The Ghouls sourcebook is actually very good, but I keep pointing behind my shoulder because I've got them all right there, but ghouls always felt somewhat out of place in a coterie of vampires. Now they are more playable. Blood potency still can't rise above 0, so there's certain restrictions on them, but they're not as weak as they were, thankfully. And, of course, following that, you have a whole ream of merits for ghouls and lots of conditions. You don't actually need them printed on cards. They are all there. So my final thought on this book, and I'm going to say my final negative thought, is the Strix, the way they've been handled in this book, I love them as an antagonist. I love the idea of them, just as I love the idea of Seven and Belial's Brood in Vampire the Requiem First Edition, but they don't feel seamlessly integrated. They have a chapter all to themselves, which is lovely, it's resplendent with detail, but the issue is they pretty much solely exist within that chapter. They are a take them or leave them kind of thing, and I can see, in fact I've heard of a number of storytellers thinking, well, this book is fantastic, I love the new rules, it will help me run Vampire the Requiem a lot easier, but the Strix just don't gel for me. People have told me this. I don't necessarily agree, but I can see why they've come to that conclusion because of the way they've kind of been given their own section in the book rather than being laced throughout it. They appear to some degree in the fiction, but I think that's a valid criticism. Now, the strengths of this book are, frankly, the quality of the writing, the quality of the art. There is very little to fault in the way of content here. Yes, some of the layout is not how I would, I suppose, prefer it, but the actual content of this book, the new rules, there is so little for me to criticise in the way of rules, and that's fairly odd for me. Usually that's what I focus on. The rules are incredibly strong. The structure of this book and the way in which you can enforce it in a chronicle, on a player, on yourself as a storyteller, the elements that are just waiting to be snatched from the pages of this book are brilliant. They are fantastic. I can say quite honestly, and without feeling swayed by any allegiance I may have to Onyx Path Publishing, this is a real highlight for me of the New World of Darkness. It corrects everything that was perhaps wrong with Vampire the Requiem First Edition. And yes, I see some people saying, well, owls don't make scary antagonists. Well, I'm sorry, you're not letting your imagination take control there. If you've ever had an owl screeching at you and trying to claw at you with its talons, and as its head turns around, you would probably say otherwise. And anyway, they still draw the breath from humans, they still draw the souls from vampires. They are still vampires, they're just very different vampires. A vampire of a different genesis. And I think you will be incredibly pleased to buy this, to read it, even if you never even got a chance to run it or play it, and I hope you do. The reading of it alone is a joy. And to say that about a role-playing game that is over 300 pages long, I believe, that's something. That's saying something. Because a role-playing game can very easily be dry. This book is anything but. It's moist with blood. And it's just asking you to pry open the pages and sample the delicacies within. Thank you very much for watching this incredibly extended review.